Welcome to Wisdom Docs. In June, in New England, it snowed. Not a flurry, not a freak hour of cold that melted by noon and left the farmers laughing about it later. Real snow in the month of June, settling on the new green of the fields, on the corn that had just come up, on the apple blossom that should have been turning into fruit. The year was 1816, and across Vermont and New Hampshire and up into Quebec, people stood in their doorways and watched white come down out of a summer sky, and they did not understand why. They had no word for it yet. The newspapers would later give it one. They would call it the year without a summer. And the strange thing, the thing that takes a moment to settle into the mind, is that the cause of it all was already gone. The mountain that did this had finished erupting a year earlier, and half a world away, on an island most of these New England farmers had never heard of and would never hear of. The cold that ruined their harvest had crossed the entire planet on something they could not see, something thin and high and quiet, drifting in a part of the sky above the weather, above the clouds, above the rain. So let me start there, because it is the heart of everything we are going to talk about tonight. Let me show you the thing you cannot see. When most people picture a volcano cooling the world, they picture ash. They picture that towering black column, the grey rain of grit that buries cars and roofs and whole towns, and they assume that this is the curtain that blocks the sun. It is a reasonable guess. It is also wrong. Ash is heavy. Ash is, in the end, just very small pieces of rock, and rock, however finely ground, wants to fall. Within days, within a few weeks at most, the ash settles out of the sky. It coats the fields and chokes the rivers, and it does terrible things close to the mountain, but it does not, on its own, chill the planet for years. Ash is the part you see, and the part you see is not the part that matters. The part that matters is a gas, sulfur dioxide. 2 letters and a number on a chemist's page, SO2, but think of it instead as a smell, that sharp, eggy, struck match tang that catches in the back of the throat. A big eruption can breathe out millions of tons of this gas. And if the eruption is violent enough, if the column punches high enough, that sulfur dioxide does not stay down here in the air we breathe. It is thrown up past the clouds, up past the level where airplanes fly, up into a layer of the atmosphere called the stratosphere, which begins somewhere around 10 kilometers above the tropics and a little lower toward the poles. 10 kilometers, 6 miles or so straight up. And here is the first quiet wonder of the whole story. Up there, in the stratosphere, it does not rain. Down here, the sky cleans itself constantly. A factory pours smoke into the air, a storm rolls through, and the rain pulls it all back down to earth within hours or days. That is why the lower air, for all its filth, never stays dirty for terribly long. But the stratosphere has no weather in the way we mean it, no clouds gathering, no downpours, no washing clean. So when sulfur dioxide is lifted up into that still, dry, high realm, nothing comes to rinse it out. It lingers, and while it lingers, it changes. The sulfur dioxide finds the small amount of water vapor that is up there, and it combines with it, and it becomes something new, a fine mist of tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid aerosol, the scientists call it. Picture a haze so fine it is almost nothing. Droplets far too small to see, far too small to feel, spread across the whole top of the sky in a layer thinner than you can imagine and wider than the world. And that haze does one simple thing. It reflects sunlight. The light from the sun comes pouring down, as it always has, and it strikes this veil of acid droplets. And a small fraction of it, just a small fraction, is bounced straight back out into space before it ever reaches the ground. The Earth, in effect, becomes a little shinier when seen from outside, a little more mirror, and a little less sponge. The scientists have a word for how reflective a planet is. They call it albedo, A fresh field of snow has a high albedo. It throws the light back, which is why snow stays cold in bright sun. A dark forest has a low albedo. It drinks the light in and warms. And when a volcano lays this sulfuric veil across the high sky, it raises the whole planet's albedo just slightly for a little while. The Earth turns a fraction more of the sunlight away, and a fraction less sunlight reaching the ground means a fraction less warmth. The world cools, not forever. This is the mercy in it. Slowly, over 1 year, 2 years, sometimes 3, those tiny acid droplets drift and clump and finally grow just heavy enough to begin sinking back down out of the stratosphere, where at last the rain can catch them and carry them home. The veil thins, the sun comes back to full strength, the world warms again to what it was. But for those 1 to 3 years, while the haze hangs up there with no rain to clear it, the planet sits under a thin grey filter it cannot take off. That is the whole secret. A breath of invisible gas lifted high enough above the rain turned to a mist of acid, dimming the sun by the smallest measurable amount. For the length of time it takes a few stubborn droplets to fall 6 miles. That is how a mountain on one island reaches across an ocean and makes its snow in June in Vermont. Now, there is a number people like to reach for when they rank these eruptions, and I want to give it to you and then gently take some of its authority away, because this is the other half of understanding the whole story. The number is called the Volcanic Explosivity Index, the VEI. 2 researchers, Newhall and Self, defined it back in 1982, and it runs from 0, a gentle simmering of lava, up to 8, a true super eruption of a kind that has not happened in all of recorded history. It is a logarithmic scale, which is just a careful way of saying that each step up the ladder is roughly 10 times more than the step below. A VEI5 throws out about 10 times the material of a VEI4. A VEI6, 10 times more again. So the numbers climb slowly, but the reality behind them grows enormously. And by the time you reach a 7, you are talking about a quantity of rock and ash that is genuinely difficult for the mind to hold. And here is the catch. The Volcanic Explosivity Index measures volume. It measures how much stuff came out, how many cubic kilometers of rock and ash and pumice the mountain threw into the air. It is a measure of bigness, and bigness is not what cools the planet. Sulfur is what cools the planet. How much of that struck match gas the eruption lofted, and how high it threw it. Those 2 things, the amount of sulfur and the height it reached, decide how cold the world gets. Not the size of the bang, so you can have a relatively modest eruption, small by volume, that happens to be unusually rich in sulfur, and it can chill the Earth more than a far larger eruption that was poor in it. Size lies. Hold on to that, because it is one of the quiet threads running through everything tonight. And there is one eruption coming much later, a small and obscure mountain in Mexico that proves it beyond any argument. For now, just plant the seed. The biggest is not the coldest. Remember that, and let the rest unfold. One more piece, and then we begin properly. Where on the Earth a volcano sits changes how far its cold can travel. The high winds of the stratosphere move in great rivers, and an eruption in the tropics near the equator feeds its veil into circulation that carries it both north and south toward both poles, draping the haze over both halves of the planet at once. But an eruption far to the north, up in the high latitudes, tends to spread its cold mainly across its own hemisphere, its veil reluctant to cross the equator. So a tropical eruption cools the whole world. A northern one mostly cools the north. Keep that in your mind too, lightly, the way you would keep a hand resting on a banister in the dark. We will use it again and again. So that is the machine. Sulfur dioxide, lifted into the rainless stratosphere, turned to a mist of sulfuric acid, raising the planet's albedo, dimming the sun by tenths of a degree to a degree for 1 to 3 years, both hemispheres, if the volcano sits in the tropics until the droplets finally fall and the veil clears. 8 times in this telling, we will watch that same slow dimmer switch turned by a different hand in a different century on a different island or shore, and each time the world will go a little quiet, the harvests will fail, and somewhere, often somewhere unexpected and far away, people will go hungry under a sky that looks almost normal. Before we descend into the first of them, tell me, quietly, wherever you are, tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. Which country, which city, what the dark looks like outside your window right now. I read those, genuinely, and there is something steadying in knowing how far this small voice travels across the same planet these veils once crossed. And if you have found your way here, and you are new, you might let the channel know you would like more of these slow nights, more of these long, careful walks into old and strange things. There is no rush. There is nothing to do but settle and breathe and let me lead. Because tonight we are going down into 8 eruptions that cooled the entire planet, 8 turnings of that invisible dimmer. We will start where everyone starts, with the largest of them all in recorded history, the benchmark against which the rest are measured. And then we will wander on through a fissure in Iceland and a forgotten giant in Peru, through a vanished mountain in the South Pacific and a white catastrophe in the land of the Maya, through a small, sulfurous peak in Mexico and a sacred mountain on Bali, and at the very end we will reach the one eruption we actually watched happen, measured in real time, the one that finally turned the whole story from a guess into a fact. There is a long way to go, and we will go slowly. Let your shoulders down. Here is the first. The first is Tambora. On the island of Sumbawa, in what was then the Dutch East Indies and is today part of Indonesia, there stood a mountain. Before the spring of 1815, Tambora rose to something like 4,300 meters, a high, broad cone above the sea, green on its lower slopes, with villages scattered around its feet, and a small kingdom living in its shadow, speaking its own language, keeping its own customs, growing rice and trading along the coast. It was, by every account, an ordinary tropical mountain. People had lived beneath it for generations without much fear of it. And then, across 2 days in April, the 10th and the 11th of that month, Tambora became the largest volcanic eruption in all of recorded human history. Try for a moment to stand inside what that was. The climax came in the night, and the sound of it carried. The blast was heard around 2,600 kilometers away on the island of Sumatra. Let that distance settle. That is farther than the length of many countries. It is as if a sound made in one city were heard clearly in another, a continent's reach away. And because it was heard at such a distance, and because in 1815 no one imagined a noise could travel so far from a mountain, the sound was mistaken for something man-made. On the island of Java, the deep concussion rolling in across the dark water was taken for cannon fire. British troops stationed there believed a neighbouring post was under attack, that an enemy had come in the night, and soldiers were actually dispatched, sent marching toward a battle that did not exist, drawn out into the dark by the voice of a volcano breathing 2,000 kilometers away. There is something almost unbearably human in that image, men taking up arms because a mountain, beyond the horizon, beyond the curve of the sea, had cleared its throat. The mountain tore itself apart. When it was over, Tambora had lost roughly 1,400 meters of its own height. Picture that. Picture nearly 1.5 miles of solid mountain, the entire summit simply gone, blown out and away, so that the peak that had risen to about 4,300 meters now stood at only around 2,850. The shape of the horizon itself was changed forever in 2 days. To make a hole that size to remove that much of a mountain, Tambora ejected something on the order of 100 to 150 cubic kilometers of material. That is a VEI-7, the largest figure on that explosivity ladder that any historical eruption has reached. 100 cubic kilometers of rock and ash and pumice thrown into the sky. It is a quantity that resists the imagination, so let it stay a little blurred. Just know that it was more than any eruption any living person has witnessed, more than any in the centuries we have written down. Close to the mountain, the dying was immediate and terrible. The ashfall, the pyroclastic flows, those scorching avalanches of gas and rock that race down a volcano's flanks faster than anything can run, the tsunami that the collapse sent across the sea, and then, in the months that followed, the famine and the disease that came when the crops were buried and the fields were poisoned. The direct death toll on Sumbawa and the neighboring island of Lombok is estimated at somewhere between 60,000 and 90,000 people, and very possibly more. The small kingdom that had lived beneath the mountain was simply erased. The Tambora language, the Tambora culture, the particular way those people had of speaking and praying and naming the world, was effectively annihilated in a single season, buried under pumice and ash, and never spoken again. It is one of the few times in history we can point to a whole human tongue and say, here, in this month, it ended. And much later, archaeologists would dig into that buried world. In 2004, excavations led by the volcanologist Sigurdsson uncovered a household preserved beneath the deep blanket of pumice, the remains of a home and the people in it, frozen in the instant the eruption reached them, their bones and their belongings sealed exactly where the catastrophe found them. The researchers gave it a name that tells you everything. They called it the Pompeii of the East. Like that Roman town beneath Vesuvius, here was a moment of ordinary life, a kitchen, a doorway, a body in mid-gesture, caught and held under the ash for almost 2 centuries, waiting to be found. But all of that, terrible as it is the near story, the story of the mountain's own neighbors. The reason Tambora is the benchmark of this whole telling is the far story. The veil. Tambora sitting in the tropics threw an immense load of sulfur high into the stratosphere, and from there the high winds carried it north and south across both hemispheres, draping the entire planet under that fine mist of sulfuric acid. And the world, as a whole, cooled. The number is, at first, almost disappointing. Global average temperatures fell by roughly 0.4 to 0.7 of a single degree Celsius in the year 1816, less than 1 degree. Said aloud on its own, it sounds like nothing. You would not feel a half-degree shift if you walked from one room to another. But this is exactly the lesson that this whole night turns on. So let me say it plainly. A half-degree across the entire globe is not a half-degree everywhere all at once. It is an average, and beneath that average the climate shifts and stumbles. The growing season shortens at the edges. The first frost of autumn arrives a few weeks early. The last frost of spring lingers a few weeks late. And for a farmer, the difference between a harvest and a ruin is not the average temperature of the planet. It is whether the frost came before the corn was ripe. A modest number on a global chart becomes, on the ground, the difference between bread and starvation. And so, 1816, the year without a summer. Across New England, the killing frosts did not keep to spring. They came in every summer month. June, as I told you at the very start, brought snow to Vermont and New Hampshire and up into Quebec, settling on the new crops. July brought frost. August brought frost again. The corn, which needs warm nights to ripen, blackened in the fields. Farmers planted, watched it freeze, planted again, watched it freeze again. In the hill country of New England, families who had scraped a living from thin soil for a generation simply gave up that year and began to think about leaving, about heading west to somewhere the sky might be kinder. The cold pushed people off the land, and it was not only America. Across the Atlantic, Europe suffered through its own version of the same grey ordeal. Not snow in summer there so much as cold and relentless rain, week after week of low cloud and downpour, fields turning to mud, the grain rotting where it stood. The harvests failed across much of the continent, and where the harvest fails, the price of bread climbs, and where the price of bread climbs beyond what people can pay, there are bread riots. Crowds in the streets, granaries broken open. It was, in much of Western Europe, one of the last great subsistence crises, one of the last times that a failure of the weather itself drove ordinary people to the edge of starvation in the old medieval way, before the modern world of railways and global grain trade made such things rarer. People in 1816 did not know that an Indonesian mountain was the cause. They only knew that the sun had gone weak and the rain would not stop and the food would not grow, and they were frightened and they were hungry. There is a gentler thread in this too, and I will give it to you because it is one of the strange gifts of that dim year. By the shore of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, a small group of friends had gathered for what was meant to be a pleasant summer holiday. But the summer never came. The weather kept them shut indoors day after day under the same low gloom that hung over the whole continent, the lake grey, the rain steady, the sky the colour of ash. And to pass the long dark hours, they set themselves a game. Each would try to write a frightening story. Out of that confinement, out of that volcanic summer with the sun veiled and the rain at the windows, came two things that would shape the imagination of the world. A young woman named Mary Shelley conceived the idea that became Frankenstein, and another of the party, John Polidori, wrote a tale called The Vampire. The modern monster and the modern vampire, two of the deep roots of all the horror that has come since, were born in that one gloomy room, in that one summerless summer, because a mountain on the far side of the earth had drawn a veil across the sun and kept a handful of writers indoors with nothing to do but frighten one another. Tambora did not only kill, it also, in this small strange way, gave us our nightmares. And if you wanted to see the veil itself, you could, if you knew where to look. The painter J.M.W. Turner was working in these years, and his skies from this period are famous for their sunsets, those vivid, smouldering reds and oranges that seem almost too intense to be real. Scientists who study these things now believe that what Turner painted was, in part, the aerosol veil itself, the sulfuric haze high in the atmosphere, scattering the low light of evening into those deep, burning colors. When the sky is full of fine particles up where the light comes in at a slant, the sunsets turn extraordinary. So Turner's red and golden evenings are, in a sense, a portrait of the very thing dimming the world, the same veil that was freezing the corn in Vermont, caught on canvas as beauty. The cold and the color were the same haze, seen from two sides. Now there are two more threads often tied to Tambora, and I want to give them to you honestly, which means giving them to you with a flag raised, because they are not settled facts. They are hypotheses, ideas that scientists and historians have proposed and continue to debate, and it would be wrong of me to hand them to you as certainties just because they make a good story. The first concerns disease. There is a leading hypothesis that the climate disruption after Tambora, the changes it forced upon the monsoon and the waters of the Bay of Bengal, helped a new and more dangerous strain of cholera to emerge there, and that this new strain went on to seed the first great global cholera pandemic. It is plausible. It is taken seriously. But it is debated, and you should hold it as a maybe, not a fact. The second thread is stranger and gentler. With the harvests failing across Europe in 1816 and into 1817, the cost of feeding animals climbed sharply, and the price of oats, the fuel that horses ran on, rose high. Horses became expensive to keep, and one response to that, some historians suggest, came from a German inventor named Karl Dreiss, who built a machine he called the Lauf machine, a running machine, a wooden contraption you sat upon and pushed along the ground with your feet, steering a front wheel. It was, in effect, the ancestor of the bicycle, the first machine of its kind, and the idea is that the search for a way to travel without a hungry, costly horse helped push it into being. A volcano, in this telling, helped invent the bicycle. It is a lovely thought. It is also only a hypothesis, a popular and plausible piece of economic history, not a proven chain, and so I give it to you the same way as a maybe to turn over gently as you drift, not a fact to hold tight. And that is Tambora, the largest in recorded history. A mountain that lost 1.5 miles of its own height in 2 days, whose voice was mistaken for cannon across 2,000 kilometers, that buried a kingdom and a language under pumice, and then, with a veil of sulfur thrown into the rainless high sky, cooled the entire planet by 0.5 degrees and a little more, and in doing so brought snow to June, froze the corn in 3 countries, raised the price of bread until the streets filled with frightened crowds, gave a handful of writers by a grey lake the time to invent our monsters, and turned the evening sky in Turner's England the deep red of a slow fire. All of it from that thin, invisible mist 6 miles up, where no rain could reach to wash it away, hanging there patiently for the better part of 2 years, while the world waited, cold and hungry, for the sun to come fully back. Hold that benchmark in your mind now, that 0.5 degree, and what it did, because every eruption still to come tonight will be measured against it. And the very next one, the one we turn to next, did something even stranger. It cooled the world and killed across a continent without ever producing the kind of towering explosive blast we just watched on Sumbawa. No single great bang, no mile of summit blown away in a night, just a long, slow 8-month bleeding of gas from a crack in the ground in Iceland, and a poison fog that would creep south across Europe and settle into the lungs of people who had never seen a volcano in their lives. The fissure opened on the 8th of June, 1783. Not with a single detonation, not with a mountain tearing itself apart in one catastrophic night, but quietly, as such things sometimes do. A long crack appearing in the ground of southern Iceland, 27 kilometers of earth splitting apart and beginning, almost gently, to bleed. The system is called Laki. The name translates roughly as the craters of Laki, after the small shield volcano that sits at the center of the fissure chain. But Laki itself was not the story. The story was the crack. The story was what came out of it, slowly, over the next 8 months, and what that slow bleeding would do to people living far to the south, in countries whose citizens would not have been able to point to Iceland on a map with any confidence. It is worth pausing on the shape of this eruption because it is so different from Tambora and from most of what comes to mind when we imagine a volcano. There was no single summit. There was no moment of catastrophic collapse. What the people of Iceland witnessed was a chain of vents opening along those 27 kilometers of fissure, erupting simultaneously in some places, sequentially in others, pouring out basaltic lava, dark, iron-rich, fluid lava that traveled far across the landscape. By the time the eruption concluded in February of the following year, somewhere between 14 and 15 cubic kilometers of lava had emerged from the Earth, coating great stretches of the Icelandic interior in one of the largest lava flows of the past 1,000 years. But lava was not the killer. Not in Iceland, and certainly not in England or France. The killer was sulfur. And here is where Laki becomes the most important entry in this whole long catalogue for anyone who truly wants to understand how the planet cools. Because alongside those 14 cubic kilometers of basalt, the Laki fissures released an estimated 120 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. That number requires a moment to absorb. Tambora, the greatest explosion in recorded history, the eruption we just spent so long inside, injected a large quantity of sulfur. Laki injected more, not explosively, not in a single violent night that shook the ground 2,000 kilometers away, but steadily, persistently, over 8 months, bleeding that sulfur up into the sky the way a slow wound bleeds. Not spectacular, but ultimately devastating. And enough of it reached the stratosphere, that high, cold layer above the weather where there is no rain to wash anything away, that the same chemistry as always began to unfold, the sulfur dioxide combining with water vapor to form fine droplets of sulfuric acid spreading in a veil, thinning the light that reached the surface below. Think of it this way: Tambora was a single, catastrophic spill of dye into a tank of water. Vivid, immediate, impossible to ignore. Laki was a slow drip that never quite stopped, feeding the same dye into the same tank for the better part of a year. The result, in terms of atmospheric chemistry, was comparable. In terms of human perception on the ground, it was almost harder to trace because there was no single, terrible night to point to, no obvious explosion to blame. There was only the fog, the strange, dry, sulphurous fog that arrived. In Iceland itself, the consequences were immediate and nearly incomprehensible in their scale. The Icelanders called what followed the Moduhardindin, the mist hardships. It is a name that captures something of how the catastrophe arrived. Not as fire or flood, not as the obvious violence of a pyroclastic flow, but as a mist, a discoloration of the air, a smell. And then, slowly, the dying. The gases that poured from the Laki fissures were not only sulfur dioxide, there was also fluorine, fluorine-laden gases that settled into the grass across a wide area, that were absorbed by the soil, that passed into the water, and the sheep and cattle and horses that grazed the Icelandic pastures ate that grass and drank that water, and something went wrong inside them. A condition called fluorosis, in which fluorine accumulates in bones and teeth, warping and weakening them until the animals simply could no longer stand. Roughly half of Iceland's livestock died. 50 to 60% of the sheep and cattle that had sustained the island's people through its long winters were gone by the time the fissures finally stopped bleeding. The fish in some rivers died as well. The hay that might have sustained surviving animals was contaminated. Iceland, in the winter of 1783 to 1784, was a place of extraordinary suffering. Famine spread across a population that had almost no margin for catastrophe, even in ordinary years. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 20 and 25% of the entire Icelandic population perished. Roughly 10,000 people, perhaps more, from starvation and from disease that moved easily through a malnourished population. The Danish authorities, who then governed the island, discussed the possibility of evacuating Iceland entirely, of simply abandoning the place, relocating its surviving population somewhere the land could sustain them. The island pulled back from that edge, but only barely. The Moduhardindin left wounds in Icelandic cultural memory that lasted for generations. But Iceland at least had the eruption nearby. Iceland could see the fissures, smell the gases, make some accounting of what had happened, even if the full chain of causation was not yet understood. What happened to the south across the open Atlantic was stranger and in some ways more disturbing because the people who suffered it had no volcano to blame. The summer of 1783 in Europe was a peculiar, unsettling season. People across England, France, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, and further east noticed a strange quality to the air. Not rain, not clouds exactly. A dry, persistent haze, sometimes described as a fog, sometimes as a blue-white mist, sometimes as a kind of smoky quality that dulled the sun even on otherwise clear days. The smell of sulfur was recorded in numerous places, faint but present. The sky had a quality to it that observers found difficult to describe precisely, but that clearly troubled them. Gilbert White, the English naturalist whose meticulous records of the natural world around his village of Selborne in Hampshire remain among the finest observational diaries in the English language, noted the strange haze with characteristic precision. He described a peculiar, hot and smoky summer, the air filled with a dry fog that was unlike anything in his long experience of English weather. He was not the only one recording it. Across Europe, correspondents of scientific societies wrote of the haze, of the dimmed sun, of the odd quality of the evening. And in Paris, where he was serving as American minister to France, a man named Benjamin Franklin was paying close attention. Franklin was 67 years old in the summer of 1783 and had spent a lifetime observing natural phenomena with the same restless practical curiosity that had led him to fly a kite in a lightning storm. He noticed the haze, he noted it in correspondence, and in 1784 he sat down to work through what it might mean. He presented his thinking to the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society. The persistent dry fog, he reasoned, was dimming sunlight across Europe, and this dimming might explain why the winter of 1783 to 1784 had been so exceptionally and cruelly cold. He suspected the haze had come from the volcanic activity in Iceland. He had been informed of the eruption, and he speculated that volcanic exhalations were reducing the amount of solar radiation reaching the surface. It was not a complete account of the mechanism. Franklin did not know about sulfuric acid aerosols, did not know about the stratosphere in the modern sense, did not have the tools to measure what was happening in the high atmosphere. But the essential connection was there, drawn clearly and calmly on paper: a volcano in Iceland, a haze in the sky, a brutal cold, a connection between them. It was one of the earliest scientific arguments ever made, linking a volcanic eruption to a change in climate, and it was made not by a geologist or a climatologist, but by a retired printer, diplomat, and experimenter sitting in Paris, watching the strange light and asking the obvious question that most people were not yet thinking to ask. The cold that followed the summer of 1783 was severe. The winter of 1783 to 1784 across Europe and eastern North America was one of the most brutal in living memory. Temperatures in England were exceptionally low for weeks at a time. Across the Atlantic, the winter settled hard and early. The Mississippi River froze at New Orleans, a thing so unusual that those who witnessed it wrote of it as a wonder, something their children would not believe. Ice was reported in the Gulf of Mexico. The Chesapeake Bay froze. The Seine in Paris froze. In England, modern epidemiological work has attempted to count the excess deaths, the deaths above the expected baseline for a normal year, during the summer of 1783 and the winter that followed. The numbers are estimates built from parish records and historical demographic data, and they carry real uncertainty. But one careful reconstruction concluded that approximately 23,000 more people died in England during 1783 than would have been expected in a typical year. Not from the eruption, not from ash or lava, from the poisoned air and from the cold. 23,000 people in one country, a country with no volcano on its soil, no awareness of a great eruption in any meaningful public sense, dying in measurably elevated numbers because of what was happening in the stratosphere above them. Across Europe, the pattern was repeated, though the numbers are harder to compile. Elevated mortality in France, in Scandinavia, in parts of Central Europe. Crop failures in 1783 and the difficult harvest that followed. The price of bread rising, the social fabric strained in ways that were at the time attributed to ordinary hardship, without any volcanic explanation being available or even thinkable for most people. Here is where the historians become careful and where it is important to be equally careful. Some scholars have argued that the hardship of the Laki years, the failed harvests, the elevated mortality, the high bread prices, the social strain across France in particular, formed a kind of background pressure, one contributing stress among many in the chain of circumstances that led eventually to the French Revolution of 1789. The argument has a certain logic to it. An Icelandic fissure eruption in 1783 helping to load the powder keg of French society, such that when 1789 came with its own harvest failures and political crises, the keg was already closer to its limit. It is an argument that has been made by serious historians, but it must be held at exactly that level. A debated hypothesis, not settled history. The French Revolution had causes that ran decades deep: the fiscal crisis of the Bourbon monarchy, the structural inequalities of the Ancien Régime, the influence of Enlightenment thought, the weakness of Louis XVI's government. To say that a volcano caused the French Revolution would be wrong. To say that a volcanic haze over Europe in 1783 contributed at the margins to the suffering that kept French peasants at the edge of their endurance across the 1780s is a more measured claim, and one that some historians consider worth taking seriously. Keep it at that distance, at the edge of the candlelight, where the uncertain things belong. What is not uncertain is the sulfur. What is not uncertain is the 120 million tons of it. What is not uncertain is the dry fog over England that Gilbert White wrote down, or the frozen Mississippi that travellers noted with wonder, or the 23,000 extra names in the English parish registers. Laki did not need a single terrible night to accomplish all of that. It needed only time and a crack in the ground and the quiet, persistent chemistry of sulfur meeting water in the cold dark above the clouds. This is what makes Laki so important as the second entry in a night of volcanic winters. Tambora taught us the scale of what an explosive eruption can do, the benchmark, the mile of summit gone, the snow in June. Laki teaches us something harder to see, that the mechanism does not require spectacle. It does not require the greatest explosion in recorded history. It requires sulfur and height and time. A slow wound can poison just as deeply as a sudden one. The planet's thermostat does not care about the drama of the event. It cares only about what reaches the stratosphere and how long it stays there. 8 months of steady bleeding from a crack in Icelandic ground sent 120 million tons of sulfur into the sky and cooled a continent. Hold that now, hold the image of the slow fissure and the dry fog drifting south while the parish clerks in England began noticing, without understanding why, that more people were coming to be buried. And let your breathing slow a little, because we are moving now in time and in geography to something that will seem at first even more improbable than Laki. We are going to Peru. The 19th of February in the year 1600 was not a day that much of the world would have been paying attention to. There was no particular reason to. The region around Arequipa in southern Peru was known for its fertile valleys, its vineyards, and a certain prosperity built on the wine trade. The Spanish colonial economy had established itself across this part of the Andes, and the grapes grew well in the valley soils, and the wine travelled to markets across the hemisphere. It was, by most measures, a functioning place, productive and inhabited, and going about its ordinary life. And then the mountain that had been there quietly all along, the mountain called Huaynaputina, woke up. Almost no one in the wider world has heard of Huaynaputina. This is precisely the point. When people list the great volcanic events of the past several centuries, the name almost never appears. Tambora is there. Krakatoa is there. Pinatubo, perhaps. Huaynaputina is not. And yet what happened on the 19th of February 1600 in the Andes above Arequipa was the largest volcanic eruption in South American recorded history, the largest. And the consequences of it reached around the entire planet and cost more human lives than any other eruption we will consider tonight, not in the ash that fell on Peruvian towns, but in the slow, cold dominoes that fell across the other side of the world in the 2 years that followed. The eruption was violent. It ejected somewhere between 19 and 30 cubic kilometers of material, a plausible range for an event of this kind, where the ancient record must be pieced together from the deposits left behind. Pyroclastic flows descended the mountain's flanks and overwhelmed the villages in their path. The Arequipa region, which had made itself comfortable and prosperous in the valley below, was devastated. Estimates suggest between 1,000 and 1,500 people died in the immediate violence and in the days that followed. The famous vineyards, the economic foundation of the region's prosperity, were buried or burned. The wine trade that had supported the colonial economy of southern Peru was, in some areas, disrupted for years. An agricultural infrastructure built over decades was simply erased in a matter of days, and those who survived had to begin again on soil that the volcano had remade. That is the local story. The local story is already large enough to be significant, but the local story is not why Huaynaputina belongs in this catalogue. Huaynaputina belongs here because of what it did to Russia. A volcanic eruption in the Andes sends its plume high into the stratosphere. A tropical eruption, as we have established, and Huaynaputina sits close enough to the equator that this applies, injects its sulfur into the stratospheric circulation that connects both hemispheres. The veil spreads north and south simultaneously. It does not stay over South America. It does not respect national boundaries or the logic of proximity. It wraps the planet, thinning sunlight at every latitude, and it settles over the fields of farmers who have never heard of Peru, who could not have imagined Peru, who are simply watching the sky in the spring and noting with the quiet, experienced dread of people whose lives depend on the harvest that something is wrong with the weather this year. The year was 1601, 1 year after Huaynaputina erupted. The sulfate from its plume, confirmed now in ice cores drilled from Greenland in the north and from Antarctic ice in the south, which together bracket the globe and provide the closest thing we have to a global atmospheric receipt. 1 year after the eruption, the sulfate veil was hanging in the stratosphere above the fields of Russia, thinning the sunlight, shifting the thermal balance, advancing the date of the first killing frost by the few days or the week. That was the difference between a harvest and a failure. And in Russia in 1601, the harvest failed. It did not fail gently. It failed catastrophically. The cold descended early, the growing season collapsed, and the grain that was the foundation of everything, bread, survival, the ability of the vast Russian territory to feed itself, simply didn't come. And then it failed again in 1602, and again with somewhat less severity into 1603. 3 years of cold and crop failure in a country whose population lived very close to the margin, without the reserves or the infrastructure to survive prolonged agricultural crisis. The famine that resulted is known in Russian history as the Veliki Golod, the Great Famine. And it is among the worst demographic catastrophes in the entire recorded history of Russia. Estimates of the death toll vary, as they always do for events of this antiquity and geographic scale, but the numbers that historians have assembled from the fragmentary records of the period suggest that somewhere around 2 million people died. Some estimates place the figure higher. 2 million people in a country whose total population at the time may have been somewhere between 10 and 15 million. By some reckonings, a third of Russia's people. Dead of starvation and the diseases that follow hunger. Dead in the fields, dead in the towns, dead on the roads as people moved looking for food that was not to be found. Mass graves were dug. Contemporaries recorded the scale of the dying with horror and disbelief. The famine did not kill in silence. It killed inside a political structure that was already under pressure. The Rurikid dynasty, the line of Tsars that had governed Russia since before memory, a dynasty that traced its legitimacy back to the founders of Kievan Rus, had ended with the death of Tsar Fyodor I in 1598, leaving no clear heir. Boris Godunov, a capable administrator and statesman, but not of royal blood, had assumed the throne. His reign was legitimate in bureaucratic terms, but contested in the deeper registers of popular and aristocratic sentiment. And when the famine struck, when people began dying in those numbers, when the grain disappeared, when the roads filled with starving families, the blame fell on Boris Godunov. Not on a volcano in Peru, not on sulfuric acid aerosols in the stratosphere, on the Tsar, on the government, on whoever held power when the sky went wrong. Boris Godunov died in April of 1605, possibly of natural causes, possibly of the accumulated strain of governing through catastrophe. What followed his death was a period of Russian history known as the Smuta, the time of troubles, during which a succession of claimants fought for the Russian throne, foreign powers intervened, the country fractured into civil war, and the Rurikid legacy that had held Russia together for centuries was finally, permanently extinguished. It was not until 1613 that the Romanov dynasty established itself and a new era of stability began to emerge, a Peruvian volcano, a sulfate veil that both Greenland and Antarctic ice recorded, an early frost in Russian fields in the summer of 1601, 2 million dead, a dynasty toppled, the time of troubles, Russia remade. Take a moment with that, not because it is sensational, and it is not presented here as sensationalism, but because the chain is real and each link in it is documented, and the whole of it is the most dramatic demonstration available of what that thin, invisible acid haze can do when it settles over the wrong field at the wrong moment in history. Huaynaputina is in Peru. Russia is on the other side of the world. They have no obvious connection, and yet the sulfur tells a different story. The sulfur does not care about geography. It goes where the stratosphere takes it, and it stays there for the year or two it takes to settle out, and the crops that fail in its shadow fail for reasons that no one standing in the field can see or name. The tree ring record, the careful dendrochronological work done by researchers who read the growth of ancient trees the way others read words on a page, measuring the width of each annual ring to reconstruct the temperature of each growing season going back centuries, places 1601 among the coldest summers of the past 600 years in the Northern Hemisphere. Not just in Russia, across the hemisphere. Records of late frosts, failed wine harvests, cold and difficult growing seasons cluster in 1601 in Europe, in China, in Japan, in other parts of the Americas. The signal is global, the fingerprint is consistent. The sulfate in the ice cores at both poles confirms a large tropical eruption in 1600. And the only candidate of the right size, in the right place, at the right time, is Huaynaputina, the mountain above Arequipa that almost no one has heard of, whose name is absent from the popular catalogues of great volcanic disasters, and whose eruption set off a chain of consequences that reshaped the political history of the world's largest country. This is why the volcanic record matters. Not for the drama of the explosions themselves, the drama is real, but it is almost beside the point, but for the slow, invisible, global consequence. Huaynaputina killed fewer than 2,000 people in the immediate violence of its eruption. The stratospheric veil it raised may have killed 2 million in Russia alone. The ash on the Peruvian hillside and the frozen harvest in the Russian fields are connected by chemistry and by atmospheric circulation and by the slim, cold margin between a growing season that completes and one that does not. The vineyards around Arequipa eventually recovered. The soils were rebuilt, the wine trade resumed. But the process took years, and the region that had been prosperous was for some time a place of ruins and replanted hopes. The survivors who stayed had to reckon with a landscape that the volcano had changed, and the reconstruction was slow and imperfect, the way reconstruction always is after a catastrophe. There is something worth sitting with in the contrast between the two sides of Huaynaputina's story. In Peru, where the eruption happened, perhaps 1,500 people died, the vineyards were buried, and the process of rebuilding began. In Russia, where no eruption happened, where the sky simply grew a little colder and the summer a little shorter, 2 million people died and a dynasty fell. Distance did not protect the Russians from Huaynaputina. The stratosphere connected them to it more completely than any road or ocean route. The veil fell equally on the fields of people who had no name for what was dimming their sun. And this is the quiet, uncomfortable truth that runs through every eruption in this catalogue, the truth that makes volcanic winters a subject worth spending a long, slow night inside. The danger is not at the volcano. The danger is in the high, cold air above all of us, where a molecule of sulfur dioxide becomes a droplet of sulfuric acid and hangs there in the dark, patient as the geology that made it, slowly reflecting a fraction of the sunlight that would otherwise have warmed a harvest somewhere that someone was depending on. Huaynaputina sits in the Andes. The sulfur it released belongs to no country and recognizes no distance. That is the lesson of 1600 and 1601 and 1603. That is the lesson of the Russian famine and the time of troubles, and the 2 million names that are not written anywhere because they died in scattered villages across a vast cold country in years when the record-keeping was overwhelmed by the dying. And Huaynaputina is the forgotten giant, the largest eruption in South American recorded history, the source of one of the coldest summers in 6 centuries of tree ring data, the eruption that changed Russia. And it is not on the list that most people carry in their heads when they think about volcanoes. Tambora is on that list, Krakatoa, Pinatubo, not Huaynaputina. Not the mountain above Arequipa that bled sulfur into the stratosphere on the 19th of February 1600, while the Andes looked the same as they had always looked to anyone watching from the valley, and the world turned slowly into its next summer. And the Russian fields waited for a warmth that the veil above them would not permit. Let that settle now. Let the distance between Peru and Russia become present to you, the vast curvature of the earth between them, the ocean crossing, the mountain ranges, the thousands of kilometers of landscape, entirely unaware of what was drifting above it, and then let the sulfur connect them again, because that connection, that invisible thread of acid in the high stratosphere, is the whole story of volcanic winters, not the volcano, not the ash, not the pyroclastic flow or the caldera or the summit that collapses, the thread, the veil, the haze that hangs above the weather, beyond the reach of any rain, slowly tilting the planet's thermal balance by tenths of a degree, that matter more than they should, that matter in the only way that counts, in the fields, in the harvest, in the quiet catastrophe of a summer that never quite arrives. And there are more entries still to come tonight, more turns of this same slow mechanism, more eruptions whose consequences found their way into the lives of people who had no idea what was happening above them or why the cold had come. One of those eruptions has no certain mountain left to point to. Another one darkened a moon above a city that was about to fall, and the people watching took it for a prophecy. And one of them, the last one, we finally watched happen in real time, with satellites tracking the veil as it spread, and scientists who had predicted the cooling waiting to see if they were right. And so we come now to the eruption with no certain mountain. That is perhaps the strangest thing this series of nights has offered so far. An event whose cold fingerprint is pressed into ice cores on opposite ends of the Earth, whose sulfate signal is among the largest of the last 700 years, whose consequences may have touched the fate of an empire, and whose source we cannot, even now, say with complete confidence. We know the cold came. We know the veil was there. The mountain itself is mostly gone, drowned under the Pacific, and the islands it left behind keep the secret of precisely what happened and when. The entry in the ice is the starting point. Glaciologists working in both Greenland and Antarctica have found, in ice layers that can be dated to around 1453, a sulfate spike of extraordinary size. The method is patient and methodical, drilling down through compressed centuries of annual snowfall, each thin band of ice a year's worth of atmosphere preserved in crystal. The sulfur from past volcanic eruptions settled there like a slow accusation. When both polar records agree, when the same chemical signature appears in the ice of the far north and the far south at the same time, that is something close to certainty about the global reach of whatever happened. A tropical eruption occurring near the equator where the stratospheric winds distribute its aerosol both ways simultaneously leaves exactly this bipolar record. Something erupted in the tropics around that time, something very large. Something sulfur-rich enough to darken skies and cool summers across half the world. The volcano that has most often been named is Kuwae, or rather, what was Kuwae, because Kuwae, as a single, continuous island, no longer exists in any form you could point to on a modern map and immediately recognize. What remains are two islands in Vanuatu in the southwestern Pacific Ocean called Tongoa and Epi, and between them lies a shallow, elongated underwater depression, a caldera of submerged rock and warm seawater, the ghost shape of what was once a much larger island. The working theory, developed across decades of geological and oceanographic investigation, is that the eruption was so violent, the emptying of the magma chamber so complete, that the roof of the volcanic structure simply fell in. The whole central portion of the island collapsed into the sea. What were perhaps the flanks and edges of a single larger landmass became two separate islands with open water between them. The caldera that remained is roughly 8 kilometers long and 5 kilometers wide, a subaqueous scar of considerable scale. If this reconstruction is right, and it is still reconstruction, still inference from the shape of the seafloor, and the geology of the remaining islands and the oral traditions of the people who have lived in this part of the Pacific for generations. Then what erupted here around the middle of the 15th century was an event of considerable force. The estimates for its volcanic explosivity index range between 6 and 7, which is to say it may have been in the same broad territory as Pinatubo, or it may have been somewhat larger, injecting a very large quantity of sulfur into the stratosphere where the veil could form and spread. The Vanuatu oral histories speak of a catastrophic event, of land that was lost, of a reconfiguration of the islands. The sea fills the space where rock once was, but here is where the honest uncertainty begins, and it is important to sit with that uncertainty rather than paper over it, because in recent years, some researchers have raised questions about whether the radiocarbon dates and the ice core chronology align neatly enough to make Kuwae the definitive source of the 1453 sulfate spike. The attribution debate is genuinely ongoing. The ice says something enormous happened. The Southern Pacific geology says something enormous happened to Kuwae. Whether those two somethings are precisely the same something occurring at precisely the same moment remains a point of careful, scholarly discussion. There may have been more than one volcanic contribution to the mid-15th century climate perturbation. The picture, as with so many things drawn from evidence this old, is not perfectly resolved. This methodological transparency is worth pausing on tonight, because it is part of what makes this kind of science both humbling and fascinating. The way researchers date eruptions from this distant past is not through eyewitness accounts. Those are rare, fragmentary, and often geographically limited. The way they do it is through the ice. Each year's snowfall in Greenland or Antarctica traps a thin sample of the atmosphere that existed at that moment, including whatever sulfate aerosol was drifting through it. A major volcanic eruption leaves a chemical layer, a heightened concentration of sulfate in a specific annual band, that stands out against the background like a signature in ink. By drilling down and counting the bands, by measuring the sulfate concentrations in each one, by comparing cores from different sites and different hemispheres, researchers can construct a chronology of past eruptions, even when the volcano itself has left no surviving witness and no surviving mountain. They are reading the planet's own record pressed into ice that formed before any living person was born. It is, if you think about it slowly, an extraordinary act of listening. The Earth keeps these records, the ice preserves them, the scientists drill down carefully and read what was written there by chemistry and time. And sometimes what they find is a sulfate spike with no attached mountain, a cold without a named source, a veil without a confirmed origin. And the work of attribution, of connecting the ice to a specific piece of geology somewhere in the world, becomes its own kind of investigation. The fact that this investigation is still ongoing for an event of this magnitude 600 years later is not a failure of science. It is an honest reflection of how much was happening in the deep past that no one was there to record. What we can say with more confidence is what the mid-1450s looked like in terms of climate, in terms of the human record that does survive. Tree ring data from both China and Europe show a cold pulse in these years. The rings of trees are another kind of archive. In a cold summer, the growth ring is narrow and dense. In a warm one, wider and more open. A run of thin rings in the mid-15th century across multiple continents tells the same story the ice tells. Something happened, something that shortened growing seasons and pressed the cold further into the months that were supposed to be warm. Harvests were difficult in parts of Europe. Records from China speak of unusual cold. The signal is there, distributed across the Earth in the chemistry of its ice and the width of its tree rings, even if the exact mountain that sent it is still the subject of careful argument. And then there is the other element of this particular eruption, the one that is harder to verify as direct causation, but impossible to set aside entirely when you are sitting with it at this hour of the night, in the quiet, letting the connections form slowly. The year is 1453, the year that most historians of the medieval world treat as a kind of watershed, a hinge. On the 29th of May of that year, the city of Constantinople fell to the Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II. The city had stood for over 1,000 years as the continuation of the Roman Empire, the great eastern capital, the city that held the accumulated weight of a civilization across more than a millennium of continuous existence. It fell in a siege that had been building for weeks, and when it fell, the Hagia Sophia, which had been a Christian cathedral for nearly 9 centuries, became a mosque before the sun set on the same day. It was, by any measure, one of the most consequential single days in the political and cultural history of the world, and the chronicles of that siege, Byzantine accounts written by people who were there, or close enough to there to be recording what they heard and saw, describe the sky behaving strangely. There are accounts of the moon rising blood red or appearing darkened in ways that were unusual and disturbing to those who watched it. There are references to an eclipse-like dimming, to atmospheric effects that seemed wrong for the season. The defenders of Constantinople and the people inside the city watched these phenomena with the kind of attention that frightened people give to anything that seems to confirm their fears. And there was a prophecy. The city's defenders had long carried with them a belief, a tradition, that Constantinople would stand until the full moon dimmed or went dark, that the darkening of the moon above the city was a sign of the end. We cannot draw a straight line of causation. We cannot say that Kuwae's sulfuric aerosol veil definitively tinted the skies over Constantinople in the spring of 1453 in ways that were perceptible to the people inside the walls. The timing is close enough to be suggestive, and volcanic aerosols do produce atmospheric optical effects that can make the moon appear reddened or dimmed when it rises through a sky carrying extra particulate matter. The twilight effects of volcanic aerosols, the deep reds and purples and the strange pallor that settles over moonrise in the months and years following a major eruption, are well documented in the historical record for other eruptions. So the phenomenon the chronicles describe is physically the kind of thing that volcanic aerosols can cause. What the people in Constantinople made of it is documented. They read it as the prophecy come true. They read the dimmed moon as confirmation that the city was lost, and some accounts suggest that this sense of doom, this surrender to what felt like inevitable fate, affected the morale of the defenders in those final hours. Whether this is true, whether a volcano in the South Pacific contributed in any causal sense to the psychological collapse of a defense, is a question that history cannot answer with certainty. But the chronicles saw what they saw, and they interpreted it the way frightened people interpret a sky that behaves wrongly. And somewhere above them, drifting in the high stratosphere, there may have been the diffuse and invisible residue of an enormous eruption from thousands of kilometers away, its sulfuric acid droplets scattering the light that passed through them, tinting the moon above a doomed city a shade darker than it should have been. A South Pacific caldera may have shadowed the death of an empire, present that as what it is, a documented atmospheric effect whose ultimate cause remains tied to an attribution debate and a contemporary perception recorded in chronicles written by people who were there. The connection is real in its layers even where the chain of cause is not fully closed. The sulfate spike in the ice remains. The cold pulse of the 1450s remains. The lost island, the submerged caldera, the two separated pieces of Tongoa and Epi lying on either side of the drowned space where the old mountain used to be, these remain. And the city fell on the 29th of May with a strange moon above it, in a year when the world's ice was quietly absorbing the record of something that had gone very wrong in a volcanic chamber on the other side of the Earth. Let that settle as we move now to a different kind of entry and to a different kind of uncertainty, because the next eruption in this sequence is one whose date was also disputed for many decades, whose consequences were also reassigned as the science sharpened, and whose connection to one of the most famous and mysterious climatic anomalies of the last 2 millennia is now, after much careful work, mostly severed. And that severing is itself the lesson. The volcano is Ilopango in what is now El Salvador. And the eruption is now best dated to around the year 431 of the Common Era, give or take a few years in either direction, through a technique called radiocarbon wiggle matching, a method that works by comparing the radiocarbon content of wood or organic material buried in the volcanic deposits against the known variations in atmospheric radiocarbon over time, finding the moment on that curve where the sample's signal fits, and thereby arriving at a date more precise than a single radiocarbon reading alone could provide. The reason the date matters, and the reason it was disputed for so long, is that Ilopango was for many years a leading candidate to explain one of the most dramatic and unsettling events in the entire record of the last 2,000 years, the Great Dimming of 536. Historians and climate scientists working with ice cores, tree rings, and historical chronicles have identified the years around 536 and 540 of the Common Era as among the coldest, most disrupted of the entire period since the fall of Rome. The historian Procopius, writing in the 6th century, described the sun in 536 as giving its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. The sun rose each day but delivered something less than its full warmth and illumination, a dimming, a pallor, a reduction in what people could see and feel. The Irish annals speak of bread failures. The Byzantine chronicles speak of unusual cold. Tree ring records from Scandinavia, Siberia, and the Americas all show sharply narrow growth rings centered on 5 and 36 in the years immediately following, indicating growing seasons so cold and short that trees could barely add width to themselves. By some measures, the summer of 536 was the coldest summer of the last 2,000 years in the Northern Hemisphere, and the years around 5140 were not much warmer. It was a sustained cold snap, lasting roughly a decade, that devastated agriculture across a wide band of the Northern Hemisphere and contributed to famine, population displacement, and very possibly the severity of the plague of Justinian that ravaged the Mediterranean world in the 540s. For a long time, Ilopango was the suspect. A very large Central American eruption occurring sometime in the middle of the first millennium, depositing a white ash called Tierra Blanca Coven, the young white land, across a vast swath of the landscape. Tierra Blanca Hoven is an appropriate name. The tephra, the volcanic material that settled across the region, is pale, fine-grained, and so thick in places that it smothered everything beneath it. El Salvador's landscape in the vicinity of the eruption was buried under meters of this white material. The surrounding region became uninhabitable. Tens of thousands of square kilometers of the southern Maya highlands were abandoned by the people who had been living there. The evidence of that abandonment is in the archaeological record. Settlements emptied, agricultural systems discontinued, populations that moved and did not come back for generations, or came back only in diminished numbers to a landscape that had been fundamentally altered. The volume of this eruption was substantial. Estimates range between 30 and 55 or more cubic kilometers of material ejected, which puts it in the range of a VEI 6 approaching 7. This was a large eruption by any measure, the kind that would have sent a column of ash and gas high into the stratosphere, the kind that would have loaded the stratosphere with sulfur and formed the aerosol veil that the mechanism requires. If it had occurred in 535 or 536, it would have been a natural explanation for what Procopius saw and what the tree rings recorded. But the radiocarbon wiggle-matching work published by researchers including Robert Dull and colleagues in 2019 placed the eruption much earlier, around 431, roughly a century before the 536 event. At 431, Ilopango was certainly large enough and certainly capable of producing climate effects. But it cannot be the explanation for the crisis of 536 if it erupted in 431. The ice core chronology developed by researchers including Michael Seigel and colleagues, published in 2015, had already been moving in this direction, identifying the sulfate spike associated with 536 as coming from a source whose characteristics pointed elsewhere, likely a high-latitude eruption, possibly in Iceland or North America, somewhere that would have distributed its aerosol primarily into the northern hemisphere. A second tropical eruption around 540 may have compounded the crisis, extending the cold into the following years. But Ilopango, by these analyses, is no longer the culprit for 536. It is an earlier event with its own climate consequences around 431 and the years following, and those consequences were real: a regional climate perturbation, a cold pulse in tree rings, a period of disrupted harvests. But not the specific disaster that Procopius described. This reassignment is not a failure. It is the process working correctly. Science revises its attributions as the tools improve, the ice cores get longer, and the dating gets more precise. The radiocarbon calibration curves get refined, the wiggle-matching methods grow more sophisticated, and a volcano that was confidently named as a culprit for one event gets moved carefully to the correct position on the timeline, and the mystery of 536 remains partially open, a high-latitude eruption whose exact identity is still being debated, followed by a second tropical eruption in 540, a sequence of volcanic forcing that together drove a decade of cold unlike almost anything else in 2,000 years of recorded human experience. What Ilopango did do, and this is its own story, not borrowed importance from a crisis it did not cause, was depopulate a large and productive landscape in the southern Maya world for what the archaeological evidence suggests was a very long time. The white tephra that settled over the region was not simply a cosmetic covering, it was a destruction of the ecological systems that made the land productive. The soil beneath it was sealed. The vegetation was killed or buried. The water sources were contaminated or disrupted. The people who had been farming this landscape, building settlements, conducting trade across the Maya world, had to leave. They went north and west into the highlands, into other parts of the Maya world, carrying with them the experience of a catastrophe that their own traditions could only have described in the most extreme terms available. What happened to those populations, how they were absorbed, how they reshaped the communities they moved into, how the loss of that large productive lowland region affected the balance of power and resources within the broader Maya world, is a question archaeologists are still working to answer from the evidence buried under and within the Tierra Blanca Jovan deposits. The landscape itself eventually recovered over generations, over centuries, as volcanic soils tend to in time. The mineral richness of erupted material, once the acidity leaches out and the organic material slowly re-establishes, can make volcanic terrain among the most fertile on Earth. But that recovery happens on a timescale that helps no one who is alive when the eruption occurs. The people of the southern Maya highlands in the 5th century did not benefit from the eventual fertility. They lived through the smothering and the silence and the abandonment of everything they had built on land that had become white and still and alien. And so Ilopango takes its place in this sequence not as the explanation for the worst cold snap of the last 2 millennia, but as a very large eruption in its own right, with its own consequences for the people in its immediate reach, and with a lesson embedded in the arc of its scientific attribution. The story we tell about a volcano can change as the evidence sharpens, and that change is not a correction we should find unsatisfying. It is the process being honest. The mystery of 536 now points elsewhere, to an unnamed high-latitude volcano whose identity the ice records but whose surface geography remains unconfirmed, and that honest pointing elsewhere is more valuable than a convenient answer that the evidence does not fully support. There is something almost restful in that. The not knowing, when it is clearly named and carefully bounded, is not the same as confusion. It is precision about the limits of what we can see. The ice says a sulfate spike happened around 536. The tree rings say the summers were cold. Procopius says the sun was dim. We know the mechanism that connects all 3 of those things because Pinatubo showed us the mechanism working in real time, as we will come to in the final entry of this night. But we do not yet know which mountain or which fissure or which series of eruptions produced the spike that Procopius lived through. That question is still open. The ice is still being read. Let the white tephra of Tierra Blanca Jovan settle gently in your mind tonight. pale and deep and covering everything, the landscape it touched going quiet under it, and then slowly, over centuries, becoming soil again. Let the southern Maya highlands rest under their white layer, waiting for the time when the land would be alive again. And let the mystery of 536 remain open, its unnamed volcano somewhere in the high latitudes, its aerosol already dispersed and gone, its record compressed into the ice at both poles, waiting for the next drill and the next careful reading. We have come now through 4 of the 8 entries in this sequence. 4 eruptions, 4 veils, 4 episodes of cold, felt by people who had no idea what had struck the sky above them. Tambora and the summer that never came in New England, the red skies that Turner painted, the cold rain that kept Mary Shelley and her companions indoors at Lake Geneva. Laki and its 8 months of quiet bleeding, the fluorine in the grass, the 20% of Iceland gone, Benjamin Franklin puzzling over the strange haze from his window in Paris. Huaynaputina and its Peruvian ash drifting north into the Russian winter, 2 million people dying in a famine that fed the chaos of the time of troubles, a dynasty toppling from the touch of a volcano it never knew existed. And now, Kuwae, with its submerged caldera and its uncertain date and its possible shadow over the moon of Constantinople, and Ilopango, with its white covering of the Maya highlands, and its lesson about the honest revision of scientific understanding. 4 more remain, and they are the ones that bring us closer to the present, to the 20th century, to the moment of measurement, to the eruption that was not only watched but predicted, not only recorded but used as a calibration for the models that now tell us how the climate works and how it might, with great risk, be deliberately altered. We are moving toward that moment in the careful, unhurried way that this kind of night deserves, not rushing toward the finale, but arriving at it by the same slow mechanism the stratospheric veil uses to spread across the planet. Steady, persistent, gradually covering more of the sky until the light that reaches the surface has changed in quality. The next 2 entries in this sequence are smaller eruptions than Tambora or Huaynaputina in terms of erupted volume, but smaller in volume does not mean smaller in consequence. This is the lesson that runs through the whole sequence, and it will arrive most clearly in the next chapter of the night, where a modestly sized Mexican volcano that almost no one was watching proved, by cooling the planet more than its size would predict, that the sulfur content of a plume is the variable that matters, not the volume of rock that accompanies it. The sulfur thesis, the idea that it is not the size of the eruption but the chemistry of it, specifically the sulfur dioxide that reaches the stratosphere, that governs the degree of planetary cooling, is not just an interesting scientific correction to popular understanding. It is the key that unlocks the counterintuitive pattern running through this whole list. Tambora is the biggest eruption in the sequence, and it produced a significant cooling, but you will see before this night is finished that an eruption an order of magnitude smaller in the VEI sense produced a cooling measurable in the same tenths of a degree. The logarithmic scale of the VEI, climbing by factors of 10 in erupted volume, does not translate into a proportional scale of cooling, because volume is not the variable the climate is responding to. The variable the climate is responding to is sulfur, and sulfur is distributed unevenly among volcanic systems. Some volcanoes are sulfur-rich, some are sulfur-poor. And a sulfur-poor eruption of great volume can leave a climate signal far smaller than a sulfur-rich eruption of modest volume. Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980 with enormous violence, with a lateral blast that leveled forests across a wide area, with a column that rose into the stratosphere, with ash that fell across multiple states. In terms of spectacle and media coverage and immediate human memory, it was one of the most dramatic volcanic events of the 20th century in North America. and its effect on global average temperature was nearly undetectable, because Mount St. Helens, for all its fury, was sulfur-poor. The material it ejected was rich in silica and ash, but relatively low in the compound that the atmosphere needed to form an enduring aerosol veil. The ash fell out within days and weeks. The stratosphere cleared. The planet barely noticed, in thermal terms, that Mount St. Helens had happened. The contrast with what we will encounter in the next entry, a Mexican volcano that erupted 2 years later with far less spectacle and far greater sulfur content, is precise and instructive. It is the same lesson in different clothes, the same principle demonstrated by direct comparison, the sulfur thesis made vivid by the existence of the counterexample sitting right beside it in the historical record. But that comparison and those two entries belong to the next movement of this night. We have arrived at the place of rest between Ilopango and what comes after, the space between the ancient and the modern, between the eruptions no one measured in real time and the eruptions that were tracked by instruments, by satellites, by networks of monitoring stations and teams of scientists who had, by the late 20th century, learned enough about the mechanism to watch it happen and predict its consequences in advance. For now, let the ice cores hold what they hold. Let the tree rings stand in their silent archive, each narrow band a cold summer preserved in wood. Let Procopius's sun continue to shine without brightness over the 6th century, its cores still being red from the ice. And let the landscape of the southern Maya highlands lie under its white layer a little longer, quiet and pale in the dark, waiting for the slow return of the living world. There is more still to come tonight. The sulfur lesson has not yet arrived in its sharpest form. The eruption that cooled the planet more than its size would predict is still ahead of us. And the eruption that we finally watched, really watched, with instruments and satellites and teams of scientists already writing the equations, is still the last entry, the one that changed not just the climate record, but our understanding of what we might be able to do with that record and what we might be risking if we tried. The night continues, the mechanism continues, the thin veil of acid in the high stratosphere, in its various past instances, continues to drift across the sky of this long telling, each eruption a new casting of the same chemistry, each one finding its way into the lives of people below who felt the cold and did not know its name. Rest here a moment. In the space between the ancient world and the modern one, in the space between the eruptions no living person witnessed and the eruptions captured on film and measured by satellite, in the space where the science is still refining its dates and reassigning its culprits and reading the ice for signatures that are barely there. The world is old, and it has been cooled before, and the mechanism is the same each time. Sulfur into the stratosphere, acid aerosol forming, sunlight reflected back towards space, harvests shortened, winters deepened, people going hungry in places they could never connect to a mountain they never heard of. And the world recovered each time. The veil thinned and dispersed, the stratosphere cleared, the sunlight came back to full strength, the growing seasons returned. But the people who lived through the interval between the eruption and the clearing did not always survive to see the recovery, and their experience of the interval, the cold summers, the failed crops, the bread shortages, the political instability fed by hunger, is the true content of what a volcanic winter means, measured not in degrees of global average temperature, but in the weight of a winter that would not end and a summer that never arrived. That weight is what this night has been carrying from entry to entry, from Tambora forward. And it has 3 more entries left to carry before the night is finished, 3 more turns of the slow dimmer switch, 3 more moments when the sulfuric acid settled into the high atmosphere and the world below grew a little darker, a little cooler, and waited for the veil to clear. The seventh of those moments is perhaps the quietest lesson of all, the one that does the most instructional work while making the least noise. A mountain in the state of Chiapas, in southern Mexico, erupted in the spring of 1982, and almost nobody outside the immediate region knew it was there. El Chichon. The name means something like the bump or the swelling in the regional Spanish, a modest, even humble name for what turned out to be one of the most chemically consequential eruptions of the 20th century. It was covered in dense tropical vegetation. It was not widely monitored. It had been dormant long enough that the villages clustered around its lower slopes regarded it as simply a hill, a feature of the landscape, the kind of thing that has always been there and therefore presents no particular concern. That assumption, which is among the most dangerous assumptions a community can make about a dormant volcano, cost lives in the most direct and terrible way. In late March and early April of 1982, El Chichon erupted in a series of explosive phases that sent pyroclastic flows, those fast, searingly hot avalanches of gas and fragmented rock that move faster than a person can run and carry temperatures that no person can survive, racing down its flanks and into the surrounding villages. The estimates of the death toll vary, but the figures that appear in the research converge around 2,000 people killed, which made it one of the worst volcanic disasters in Mexican history. The people who died were not strangers to the region or newcomers who had ignored recent warnings. They were people who lived in the shadow of what they believed was a quiet hill, and the hill was not quiet anymore. And here is the lesson El Chichon teaches. The reason this small and formerly obscure mountain belongs in this sequence alongside Tambora and Pinatubo. El Chichon was, by the measure of erupted volume, not a large eruption. On the Volcanic Explosivity Index, it registered as a VEI 5, which means it sits a full step below the VEI 6 events that anchor the middle of this survey. One step on that logarithmic scale represents roughly 10 times the material. El Chichon was, in raw volume, a modest event, and yet the sulfur it lofted into the stratosphere was disproportionate to that modest size. The magma that fed El Chichon happened to be unusually rich in sulfur-bearing minerals, and when it exploded, it converted that sulfur wealth into sulfur dioxide gas, and the plume carried that gas high enough, up into the stratosphere, above the reach of rain and weather, that it formed the usual veil of sulfuric acid aerosol droplets and spread it across the northern hemisphere. The resulting cooling was estimated at somewhere between roughly 0.2 and 0.5 of a degree Celsius in the affected regions, which is real and measurable, and which came from an eruption that, judged purely by volume, had no business cooling anything so substantially. The mountain was small, the sulfur was not. There is a comparison that clarifies this point more cleanly than any amount of explanation. 2 years before El Chichon erupted, on the 18th of May 1980, a mountain in the state of Washington, in the northwestern United States, erupted with dramatic and much publicized violence. Mount St. Helens blew out its northern flank, sent a lateral blast across the surrounding forest, triggered the largest landslide in recorded American history, and produced an eruption column that reached into the stratosphere. The images of its ash cloud were broadcast around the world. It was a spectacular and deadly event, and it entered the cultural memory as a defining example of what a volcano can do. And in terms of erupted volume, Mount St. Helens was genuinely large by the standards of 20th century eruptions. It barely cooled the planet at all. The reason is sulfur. Mount St. Helens was sulfur poor. Its magma did not carry the chemical richness that, when injected into the stratosphere, produces the long-lasting aerosol veil. The ash fell out within days and weeks, as ash always does, settling back to the ground within the reach of gravity and weather, and the stratosphere was not substantially altered. The global average temperature showed no meaningful response. Mount St. Helens large and dramatic and unforgettable in its immediate violence, left almost no fingerprint in the climate record. El Chichon, smaller, quieter, unknown to most of the world even during its eruption, left a clear one. This is the sulfur thesis made tangible, the counterintuitive truth that has been threaded through this entire survey from the beginning. Size lies. What the planet feels is not the weight of the rock, but the chemistry of the gas, and only the gas that reaches high enough to escape the rain. El Chichon had the chemistry. Mount St. Helens had the volume. And when the stratosphere cast its vote, it chose chemistry. There is one additional complication to El Chichon's story, one that makes it a useful teaching case for a different reason. The aerosol veil from the 1982 eruption spread across the northern hemisphere during the same period as one of the most powerful El Niño events of the 20th century. The Great El Niño of 1982 and 1983, which warmed sea surfaces across the central and eastern Pacific, altered precipitation patterns across large parts of the globe, and produced its own distinct set of temperature anomalies. Sorting out what the volcano was doing to global temperatures and what El Niño was doing simultaneously was, for climate scientists at the time, genuinely difficult. The signals overlapped and partially cancelled and partially reinforced each other in ways that required careful statistical analysis to disentangle. The cooling from El Chichon was real, but it was partly masked, and measuring it precisely against the background of a major El Niño required exactly the kind of painstaking work that separates climate science from guesswork. That honesty belongs here. Volcanoes do not erupt into a climate system that is otherwise holding still and waiting politely for their sulfur. They erupt into a world that is already moving, warming here, cooling there, cycling through its own internal rhythms on timescales from months to decades. Reading the volcanic signal out of all that background noise is one of the central technical challenges of the whole field, and El Chichon's tangled relationship with the 1982 and 1983 El Niño is among the clearest illustrations of why. The atmosphere is not a simple instrument. It is a complicated one, and reading it requires patience and care. The mountain in Chiapas taught that too, along with its lesson about sulfur. A small mountain with the right chemistry in the middle of a complicated atmospheric moment, cooling the world while the world was also doing something else entirely. The sulfur moved through the stratosphere regardless, the veil formed regardless, and the cooling was there underneath the noise for those who looked carefully enough to find it. The 8th entry in this survey is quieter still in the sense that it is older, and it belongs to a time before satellites, before real-time monitoring, before the kind of measurement infrastructure that allows scientists to watch a volcanic plume wrap the planet within weeks of the eruption. It is Agung on the island of Bali in Indonesia, and it erupted across the early months of 1963 with its principal explosive phases running from February through May of that year. Agung is a sacred mountain to the Balinese Hindus, which is a fact that matters not as a colourful detail appended to the geology, but as a central feature of the experience the eruption created, and therefore of what the eruption means as a human event. The volcano is the spiritual axis of the island, the peak that gives the island its orientation, the mountain the Balinese traditionally keep toward their heads when they sleep, the reference point from which the cardinal directions of Balinese cosmology radiate. And in 1963, the Balinese were preparing for Ekadasa Rudra, a purification ceremony that takes place once every 100 years, a ritual of extraordinary religious significance held at the Besaki temple complex that climbs the southern slopes of Agung itself. The ceremony had not been performed for a century. The preparations were immense. The timing was cosmic, and then the mountain began to stir. There was debate at the time about whether to proceed. The mountain was showing signs of awakening, steam, tremors, the geological unease that precedes an eruption. Some religious authorities argued that the ceremony must go forward as scheduled regardless, that to delay or cancel it would itself be an inauspicious act. Others were more cautious. The ceremony proceeded, and in February of 1963, while preparations were still underway, Agung erupted, sending pyroclastic flows and lahars, those rivers of volcanic debris and water that travel down the flanks of volcanoes long after the main eruption, channeled by river valleys, dense and fast and destructive, across the villages and agricultural terraces of the mountain's lower slopes. The death toll was estimated at somewhere between roughly 1,100 and 1,500 people or more, the figures varying across different accounts and different phases of the eruption's destructive aftermath. The lava flows, in what the Balinese interpreted as a meaningful event, stopped short of the Besaki temple complex. They advanced down the slopes and then slowed and halted, and the holiest buildings of the most sacred site on the island were not destroyed. Whether one reads this as geological coincidence, a matter of terrain and viscosity, and the particular paths the lava chose among the channels available to it, or as something else, is a question the science does not answer, because the science does not answer questions of that kind. What the record shows is that the temple was not destroyed, and that many Balinese experienced this as something beyond coincidence, and that this interpretation became woven into the memory of the eruption as firmly as the death toll and the agricultural devastation. Documented cultural perception is part of what eruptions leave behind. It belongs in the record alongside the sulfate measurements. Agung's sulfur was not as extreme as the events on the heavier end of this survey. It was a VEI5 eruption, similar in scale classification to El Chichon 2 decades later, and it produced a substantial but not overwhelming sulfuric acid aerosol veil in the stratosphere. The estimated cooling of the Northern Hemisphere in 1964 falls in the range of roughly 1/10 to 3/10 of a degree Celsius. Genuine, measurable, but toward the more modest end of the effects in this survey. The people who experienced 1964 as a slightly cooler and hazier year in various parts of the Northern Hemisphere did not know why, and most of them never connected their experience to a mountain on a small island in the Indonesian archipelago that had erupted the year before. But scientists noticed, and in noticing they began to build the framework of understanding that would eventually allow the mechanism to be stated with confidence rather than inference. Studying the aerosol veil that Agung left in the stratosphere helped researchers establish with increasing clarity that the relevant agent of cooling was not the ash, not the tephra that falls back to Earth, that blocks local sunlight for days or weeks and then settles, but the sulfate aerosol that formed in the high atmosphere and persisted for a year or more after the eruption itself was over. The distinction between tropospheric effects, which clear relatively quickly, and stratospheric effects, which do not, was sharpened by observing what Agung's plume actually did over time. The groundwork that was laid by studying Agung's aftermath was part of the conceptual foundation that Pinatubo, nearly 30 years later, would confirm with the instruments and the satellites that Agung's era did not yet have. That is Agung's scientific legacy, quiet and cumulative as it is. Not the spectacle of the eruption itself, not the tragedy of the death toll, not even the strangeness of the lava stopping short of the sacred temple, but the slow accumulation of observations that helped a generation of scientists understand what the high atmosphere was doing with volcanic sulfur. The mechanism that this entire survey has been tracing, entry by entry, was partly clarified by sitting with the aftermath of a moderate eruption on a tropical island and watching what the stratosphere did with it over the course of 18 months. Science works this way sometimes, not through a single dramatic revelation but through the patient accumulation of cases, each one adding a piece, the understanding sharpening gradually until the picture is clear enough to be called knowledge rather than hypothesis. Which brings us to the last entry and to the eruption that transformed hypothesis into certainty. Mount Pinatubo stands on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, roughly 90 kilometers northwest of Manila, and before 1991 most people in the world had never heard of it. It was not a famous mountain, it was not closely watched. It had last erupted roughly 500 years earlier, which meant that the surrounding communities had lived for many generations without any direct experience of its capacity for violence, and the dense rainforest that covered its slopes had long since reclaimed whatever scars the previous eruption had left. By the late 20th century, it was simply a landscape feature, a highland that shaped the drainage of the surrounding lowlands and housed communities on its quieter flanks, including the Clark Air Base, the large American military installation that had operated in the region since the early decades of the century and represented in 1991 one of the largest American military presences in Asia. In April of 1991, Pinatubo began to wake up. Steam vents opened on its upper slopes. Earthquake swarms rippled through the rock beneath it. The mountain was communicating its intentions, and the scientists of the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, (PHIVOLCS), and the volcanologists of the United States Geological Survey, who joined them, recognized what those communications meant. They had instruments that earlier centuries did not have: seismographs to read the tremors in the rock, tiltmeters to measure the swelling of the mountain as magma pushed upward through it, gas sensors to measure the sulfur dioxide already being emitted from the vents, and the accumulated knowledge of how volcanoes behave in the days and weeks before a major eruption. They also had, crucially, the memory of what had happened in 1980 to communities near Mount St. Helens when warnings were ignored or issued too late. The decision was made to evacuate. The scale of what the instruments were suggesting would happen made it clear that the mountain was not preparing a minor event. Tens of thousands of people were moved from the most dangerous zones in the days before the climax. The evacuation of Clark Air Base, some 15,000 military personnel and dependents, was ordered and carried out. It was logistically complex and in some cases deeply contentious because the people being asked to leave their homes and their livelihoods were being asked to trust a forecast, to act on the word of scientists who were saying that the mountain would do something catastrophic on a timeline that, as of the day the evacuation orders went out, had not yet occurred. Trusting a forecast requires a kind of faith in a process that is invisible to most people. Faith that the instruments are reading correctly, that the models are sound, that the scientists are not crying wolf. The mountain confirmed the forecast on the 15th of June, 1991, when it produced the second largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century. The eruption column climbed into the stratosphere. The climax lasted hours. The explosion was heard across hundreds of kilometers. And then, making the day stranger and more complicated and in some ways more dangerous, Typhoon Yunya, a large tropical storm, was moving through the region simultaneously, drenching the landscape with rain that mixed with the volcanic ash falling from the eruption column and turned it into a dense, heavy slurry. Roofs that might have survived dry ash accumulation collapsed under the waterlogged weight of the combined material. The lahars that followed in the months and years after the eruption, as monsoon rains continued to mobilize the enormous deposits of loose volcanic material on Pinatubo's flanks, proved to be among the most destructive and long-lasting consequences of the whole event, burying farmland and villages and river channels under meters of debris over a period that stretched on for years. The death toll from the eruption and its immediate aftermath, direct deaths from pyroclastic flows, from roof collapses under the rain-soaked ash, from the lahars that followed, was estimated at several hundred to roughly 800 or more people. In the context of an eruption of this magnitude occurring in a densely populated region, that number is a testament to what the evacuation accomplished. The scientists and officials and communities who acted on the forecast, who trusted the instruments and the judgment of the people reading them, saved a number of lives that is very hard to specify with precision, but that most estimates place in the thousands, possibly tens of thousands. The evacuation of Clark Air Base alone removed 15,000 people from a zone that the eruption then made uninhabitable for years. This is the human story of Pinatubo, and it is in many ways the most hopeful story in this entire survey. The only eruption in which a substantial portion of the human cost was avoided not through luck or distance, but through science applied in time. The other entries in this survey are, with varying degrees of historical remove, stories of people who could not know what was coming because the instruments did not exist, because the understanding was not there, because the volcano had been silent for generations and gave too little warning. Pinatubo is the entry in which people knew, in which the knowing was translated into action, and in which the action measurably reduced the harm. But the atmospheric story of Pinatubo is, in its own way, equally remarkable, and it is the story that connects most directly to everything this survey has been building toward. Pinatubo injected somewhere between 15 and 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. That figure, stated as a weight, is almost impossible to feel, the way very large numbers always resist intuition. Think of it instead as an enormous invisible cloud of gas, carried upward by the force of the eruption column to altitudes well above the weather, and then released into a layer of the atmosphere where there is no rain, no moisture cycle capable of washing it out, no mechanism to bring it back to Earth quickly. The sulfur dioxide combined with the trace water vapor present in the stratosphere to form droplets of sulfuric acid, each one microscopically small, collectively forming a diffuse and transparent haze that spread across the globe as the stratospheric circulation carried it east and west, north and south. Satellites tracked it in real time. Within weeks, the veil had wrapped the planet. The science of what happened next was not a surprise to everyone who watched it unfold. James Hansen, the climate scientist, and his colleagues had published a forecast before the eruption's climax. Based on the sulfur emissions being recorded from Pinatubo's vents in the weeks leading up to the June 15th explosion, they predicted that the eruption would cool the global average surface temperature by roughly 0.5 degrees Celsius over the following 1 to 2 years. The prediction was specific, it was quantified, and it was made in advance. The planet then cooled by roughly 0.5 degrees Celsius. The veil produced spectacular sunsets around the world in the months following the eruption, the kind of vivid reds and oranges and purples that occur when there is more particulate matter than usual in the upper atmosphere to scatter the longer wavelengths of sunlight at the edges of the day. People noticed the sunsets without necessarily knowing their cause. Atmospheric scientists noticed something else, a measurable temporary thinning of the stratospheric ozone layer, as the sulfate aerosol provided surfaces on which ozone-destroying chemical reactions could proceed more efficiently. The connection between volcanic aerosols and ozone chemistry is part of the fuller picture of what a major stratospheric eruption does, and Pinatubo provided the data to study it at a scale and with instrumentation that no previous eruption had allowed. By roughly 1993 and 1994, the veil had thinned and dispersed. The sulfate particles settled gradually back to Earth by mechanisms different from rain, but equally slow and gradual at stratospheric altitudes. The sunsets returned to their ordinary colors. The global average temperature climbed back toward the underlying trend, and the warming signal that the volcanic cooling had briefly masked resumed its upward movement. Pinatubo had pressed pause on a warming world for 2 years, and then the world resumed. But the significance of Pinatubo did not end when the veil cleared. The eruption had done something that no previous volcanic event had managed. It had provided a real-world, full-scale natural experiment in exactly the mechanism that some scientists and policymakers were beginning to discuss in another context entirely. For decades, as the evidence for human-caused climate warming had accumulated and the conversation about possible responses had broadened, one idea that kept appearing in technical discussions was this: could we deliberately inject sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere mimicking what volcanoes do naturally and thereby cool the planet intentionally. The proposal goes by several names: stratospheric aerosol injection, solar geoengineering, solar radiation management, and it is among the most consequential and contested ideas in contemporary environmental science. The debate is real, and the concerns on every side of it are serious. Deliberately altering the planet's radiative balance would have effects on precipitation patterns, on monsoons, on agricultural systems, on stratospheric ozone, on the distribution of cooling across different latitudes and different communities. A deliberate injection program would cool some places and affect weather in others, and the people who bear the negative effects of the intervention would not necessarily be the same people who made the decision to intervene. The governance questions alone are staggering. Who decides, by what authority, on behalf of whom, and what happens if the injection is started and then stopped suddenly, producing a rapid warming rebound that could be worse than the original problem? Pinatubo did not resolve these questions. It was not designed to, and a single volcanic eruption cannot answer questions that are fundamentally about human choices and political arrangements. But Pinatubo did something that the questions urgently needed. It provided measured data on what a significant injection of stratospheric sulfate actually does to global temperatures, regional climate patterns, ozone chemistry, and the atmospheric systems that govern the weather that most people on Earth depend on for their food. Before Pinatubo, projections about stratospheric aerosol injection were based on models and on the incomplete historical record of previous eruptions. After Pinatubo, those projections could be calibrated against a real event of the relevant scale, measured with modern instruments, tracked by satellite, and analyzed with the statistical tools of contemporary climate science. The models that predicted half a degree of cooling were right. The mechanisms that were hypothesized were confirmed. The risks that were theorized were, at least some of them, observed. Pinatubo is therefore both the proof of the whole mechanism this survey has been tracing and the most pointed question the mechanism leaves open. Nature has been running this experiment irregularly and without human intention for as long as sulfur-rich magma has found its way to the surface and into the stratosphere. The planet has a dimmer switch, and it has been turned intermittently by forces entirely outside human control, with consequences that fell randomly on whoever happened to be farming in the wrong year, in the wrong latitude, beneath the wrong aerosol veil. Tambora dimmed the switch in 1815, and Mary Shelley wrote her novel, and the people of Vermont ate whatever they could find in the summer that never came. Huaynaputina dimmed it in 1600, and 2 million Russians died of famine before the veil cleared. Kuwae, or whatever caldera left that sulfate spike in the ice, dimmed it around 1452, and the Byzantines read a darkened moon as an omen, and the city fell, and the cold descended on the survivors regardless of which side of the wall they had been standing on. Now we know the switch exists, we know roughly how it works, we know how much sulfur is required to turn it, by how many degrees, and for how long, and with what distribution across the hemispheres, and we are beginning to have, for the first time in the history of this planet's most intelligent inhabitants, the technical capacity to reach for the switch ourselves. Whether we should, and how, and under whose authority, and with what attention to who bears the costs, these are not questions that volcanoes can answer for us. They are questions that belong to the living, to the people who will make decisions in the decades ahead about what kind of atmospheric future they are willing to accept or create. Pinatubo handed us the data. The decision about what to do with it belongs to us. And so the 8 eruptions come to rest, one by one, in the ice. Tambora, 1815, the benchmark against which all the others are measured, the year without a summer, the killing June frosts, the grey and grieving skies of Europe, the novel about a creature stitched together from dead things and brought to life in a dark year on a cold lake. Laki, 1783 and 1784, the fissure that bled for 8 months and never made a single dramatic bang, and nonetheless sent a poisonous fog across an entire continent and starved a quarter of Iceland and gave Benjamin Franklin reading the haze through the Paris sky, the first glimmer of an idea about what mountains can do to weather. Huaynaputina, 1600, the forgotten giant, the Peruvian eruption that left its sulfate in ice at both poles and killed 2 million Russians who never heard its name. Kuwae, hovering somewhere around 1452, the caldera half-drowned in the South Pacific, the mountain that may or may not have put the blood-red veil across the moon over Constantinople on the night a city died. Ilopango, around 431, the White Tephra burying the Maya Highlands, the eruption that was once blamed for the Great Darkness of 536 and was then, as the science sharpened its dating, quietly reassigned to a different century, a different culprit, the mystery passing to other ice core signatures and other unidentified mountains. El Chichon, 1982, the bump in Chiapas that nobody was watching, the sulfur-rich small mountain that outperformed its size and taught us, again, that the chemistry is everything and the volume is nearly beside the point. Agung, 1963, the sacred mountain of Bali, the lava that stopped before the temple, the moderate eruption that helped a generation of scientists understand what the stratosphere does with sulfur over the long months after the fire is out. And Pinatubo, 1991, the measured one, the forecast confirmed, the veil tracked by satellite, the half-degree cooling that arrived on schedule, and then lifted and left behind both a calibrated set of climate models and a question about what humanity might do next. 8 turns of the same slow dimmer. 8 moments when the sulfuric acid haze settled into the stratosphere, thin and invisible and impossibly high above the lives it was about to alter, and the sunlight that had been arriving at the surface in its ordinary quantity arrived instead in slightly less, and the world below cooled by tenths of a degree. And tenths of a degree moved the frosts, and the frosts moved the harvests, and the harvests failing moved everything else. The bread prices, the political arrangements, the survival and the dying, the novels and the prophecies and the interpretations of darkened moons. Tenths of a degree. It sounds like almost nothing. It is almost nothing, measured against the temperatures of daily life, against the difference between Tuesday and Wednesday, or between a warm afternoon and a cool one. But the agricultural systems that feed human populations are not calibrated for daily variation. They are calibrated for averages, for the reliable pattern of seasons, for the frost date that comes when it has always come and departs when it has always departed, giving the seeds the window they need to germinate and grow and ripen before the cold returns. Shift that average by a few tenths of a degree, and the frost date moves by days. Days that the crop needed, days that the farmers had been counting on as their parents counted on them and their grandparents before that, days embedded in the agricultural knowledge of whole regions accumulated over centuries of working a particular piece of land in a particular climate. Take those days away abruptly without warning because a mountain on the other side of the world injected its sulfur into the stratosphere, and the harvest fails. And the harvest failing is not an abstraction. It is people eating less than they need, children going to bed hungry, the grain that was supposed to last through winter running out before the winter is over, communities that cannot afford to purchase food from elsewhere because the elsewhere is also failing, because the veil is global and the cooling is global, and the sulfate cares nothing about borders or trade routes, or the particular misfortune of having been born in a place where the margin between enough food and not enough was already thin before the volcano erupted. This is the true weight of a volcanic winter, and it is lighter than it sounds, lighter than the movies, lighter than the word catastrophe suggests because it does not arrive all at once in a single, visible disaster. It arrives as a cold summer, as a grey June, as a frost in August that nobody expected, as a harvest that is thin and late and then fails entirely, as a winter that begins too early and ends too late, and as the slow, grinding arithmetic of too many people and not enough food playing out over 2 or 3 years, while the acid veil, high above all of it, gradually disperses and the sunlight returns and the seasons normalize and the people who survived begin the long work of recovery, which is always longer and harder than the event that made it necessary. The planet has done this before. Many times before, on timescales far longer than the 8 events this survey has traced. The ice cores that carry the sulfate records of Tambora and Huaynaputina and Kuwae carry older signatures still, going back thousands of years, and the largest of those older signatures, from eruptions so vast they make Tambora look modest by comparison, speak to coolings and disruptions on scales that dwarf anything in the historical record. The planet recovered from those too, in the fullness of geological time. The distinction that matters is the one between geological time and human time, between the time scale on which the planet heals and the time scale on which a person lives, a family survives, a civilization maintains continuity with itself. On the geological timescale, every volcanic winter ends. On the human timescale, every volcanic winter ends too. But not necessarily before the people living through it have paid its full price. What this night has been carrying from entry to entry, from the June snow of 1816 to the satellite-tracked veil of 1991, is that price. And the understanding that now exists, the ice core records, the tree ring chronologies, the sulfate measurements, the climate models calibrated against Pinatubo's real-world experiment, is the accumulated effort of many generations of scientists to read the price clearly, to understand the mechanism precisely enough to know what we are looking at when a mountain erupts and to know, going forward, how much of that price we might see again and under what circumstances. The stratosphere is quiet tonight. The sulfate that Pinatubo left there has long since settled back to Earth. The acid droplets that once wrapped the planet in a thin planetary scarf of scattered sunlight are gone, their brief existence recorded in ice cores drilled from the polar caps and in the temperature records of the early 1990s, and in the notebooks of the atmospheric scientists who watched them form and spread and thin and disappear. The eruptions that preceded Pinatubo by centuries and by millennia left their own traces in those same cores, acid layers stacked in the ice like pages in an archive, each one the signature of a different mountain, a different year, a different cooling, a different harvest that failed somewhere for someone who did not know why the summer had gone cold. The archive is still there, under the ice of Greenland and Antarctica, waiting to be read. And the mountains are still there too, Tambora, with its broken caldera, still rising from the sea off Sumbawa. Agung, its slopes still sacred, still carrying the memory of the lava that stopped. Pinatubo, its summit reshaped by the 1991 collapse, its surrounding valleys still being gradually reclaimed from the Laha deposits that buried them, and somewhere in the South Pacific, where Tongoa and Epi now stand on either side of the open water that was once Kuwae, the sea floor holds whatever remains of the mountain that cooled the world around 1452, the mystery in the ice, the caldera that has no name beyond the one assigned to it by scientific inference. They are not done. Volcanoes are not historical events, not past tense, not safely archived alongside the things that happened once and will not happen again. They are geological processes ongoing, driven by the same heat in the same mantle that has been generating them for as long as the planet has had a crust to push through. The question is not whether another large, sulfur-rich, stratosphere-penetrating eruption will happen. The question is when and which mountain and how much sulfur it will carry, and whether the world has enough scientific infrastructure and enough international cooperation to respond with the same combination of forecast and evacuation that worked at Pinatubo. The answer to that last question is one that people alive today will have some role in determining. The monitoring networks that saved lives at Pinatubo were built by investment and maintained by ongoing commitment, and staffed by people who spent careers preparing for events they hoped would never happen. That kind of preparation is quiet work, invisible in the years when the mountains are quiet, and easily overlooked in conversations about what is worth funding and supporting and maintaining. It becomes visible only when the mountain speaks, and by then it is too late to build the network from scratch. Pinatubo, the last of these 8 entries, is therefore also a reminder about the value of the preparation that made its human story different from the human stories of Tambora and Huaynaputina and Laki. Different not in the eruption itself, but in the response, in the space that knowledge and instruments and institutional readiness opened between the mountain's violence and the full weight of the consequences it could have imposed. That space is narrow. It is always narrow, but it is not nothing. The stars are overhead wherever you are listening from tonight, and the stratosphere through which 8 veils of sulfuric acid once spread is transparent and quiet above them. The volcano that will eventually add a 9th layer to the ice core archive is somewhere on this planet right now, waiting in its own geological time, holding its sulfur in the rock. But tonight, the sky is clear. Tonight, the sunlight that arrives tomorrow will arrive in its ordinary quantity, and the seasons will proceed on their ordinary schedule, and the frost will come when it is expected, more or less, and the harvests will depend on the usual variables and not on an invisible high-altitude haze no one can see or feel. Tonight, the dimmer switch is set where we left it. If you feel moved to share where in the world you are listening from, I would genuinely like to know. The comments are there, and I read them. And knowing that this slow descent into sulfur and ice and the long memory of cold has reached someone in their particular corner of the earth is a real and quiet thing, the kind of thing these long nights are for. There are more stories here of the same slow and careful kind, waiting for whenever you want them. The archive is deep and the nights are long and there is no hurry. You have done enough for one night. Put down whatever remains of the day. Let the mountains be quiet for a few hours. Let the stratosphere hold nothing but the ordinary cold of altitude. Let the stars above the clouds be simply stars. Tie off here at the wisdom docks. The tide will wait till morning.